Hmm. Terrors. Can you fill in those, will you please fill in those name blocks?
Sure. Tachovsky.
Okay, wow, that I would have gotten that completely wrong. Okay. So would you like to talk about your book then?
Well, I'm going to start with a little video
Okay,
that I'll share.
okay.
Taking the flag kind of bothered me because it's so special, I think. And it's like it part of him. He had it tucked into his coat, and I barely saw it. And I just about didn't take it, but then I thought, at least if I take it, it'd be a chance I can get it back. And if somebody else did, maybe they'd never see it again, you know.
He pointed Frank Tachovsky, who's my friend. I talked to him a couple of times a week. He's dying. He's 94. He lives in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And he was the lieutenant. Well, he come to my tent and he said, I'm with the leader of the new Scout Sniper Platoon. You're my platoon sergeant. I said, Frank, I'm only a buck sergeant. He said, you're going to be my platoon sergeant. So I was. And we went around and he said, now we're going to get 30, I believe it was 32 men. And so he put the word out to all the battalions. He'd be coming around on such a date, and he didn't want to see the men. He just wanted to look at their record books. And I went with him. And he'd go in the field office there and say, well, I want to get the names of the guys that volunteered for the Scout and Snipers. And he didn't want to talk. He just looked at the record book. Brig time. He's my man.
Oh, really?
Yeah, really. He took the guys that had bad record, that they had spirit.
A eulogy at my father's funeral in 2011 sent me on a journey to get to know more about the young officer his Marine buddies referred to as Ski. Opening his footlocker in the garage, I found old letters, photographs, magazines, his wintergreen uniform, a tattered old USMC blanket, and that was about all that remained from his service as a Marine in the Pacific during World War II. But I wanted to know more about my dad and the men whose names who were on that old typed Scout Sniper roster, about who they were, what they did, and what they saw. It would take 9 years for 40 Thieves on Saipan to come to fruition, tracking down the surviving members of his platoon. These 19 and 20-year-old boys who fought together on Saipan are now old men in their 80s and 90s. Old men with incredible stories about my dad, about themselves, and their own experiences during the battle for Saipan. It's been an incredible journey.
So, a lot of kismet took place in the making of this book. The eulogy at my father's funeral, if that gentleman had not gotten up to speak, I never would have opened the footlocker, never connected the dots, and none of this would ever have begun. And the eulogy that was delivered was, at first the gentleman got up to speak, and he was, I don't want to say inconsequential, but you wondered kind of why he was getting up, and he talked about Dad's tenure as mayor. And then he talked about the first time that he met Frank Tachovsky, and that was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison about 1955. And that fellow was there as a 19-year-old Naval ROTC kid, and Dad was there on the GI Bill, and he stood out to him because he was old. And at these Naval ROTC meetings, there'd always be this Marine sergeant who was in his dress blues and crew cut and every inch a Marine. And if you had occasion to say your name, he'd just bark it out. But one day he saw Frank talking to the sergeant, and the sergeant was uncharacteristically happy, and they were laughing and joking about. And the fellow thought it was odd at first, but didn't think anything more of it until he saw it happen a few more times. And finally, he went up to the sergeant and said, "Excuse me, but how do you know Frank Tachovsky?" And he said, "That man is Lieutenant Tachovsky to you, and when you speak of him, you do it with respect." He was our platoon leader on Saipan when a Japanese tank broke through our lines. It kept advancing on us. We had no weapons to fight it with, and we all thought we were goners. And suddenly, out of nowhere, I see this solitary figure run into the withering fire. He shoots a bazooka, disables the tank, and kills the crew inside. That was the lieutenant. He saved my life that day. He saved the life of every man in the platoon. Every day is a bonus because of that man. So when you speak of him, do it with respect. Now, needless to say, if a pin dropped on the carpet at that point, you could have heard it. And that eulogy kept on replaying in my mind, and I went online and did a search of our last name, which is so easily butchered, and up popped this Leatherneck website with this article from the December 1944 Leatherneck magazine. And beneath it was a little bit of text saying, it was posted by a fellow named Chris Tipton. And the text said, "This was my father's platoon during World War II. And everything in the article is correct, except we were never known as terrors. We were known as the 40 Thieves." So even before I had even thought about compiling the information as a book, the title was staring me in the face. After reading that article, I opened the green footlocker that was in the garage that no one ever touched except Dad. It's not necessarily because he told us not to, but he never spoke of the war at all. And it seemed like an invasion of privacy to open it up. But when I opened it up, it was like Christmas and time travel at the same time, along with like old timetables for the super chief from Chicago to Los Angeles, and medals and photographs of anonymous men. Up pop, I found this platoon roster for the Scout and Sniper platoon on Saipan. And the fellow who posted it was Chris Tipton. And down here, I don't know if you can see it, I can't really on my screen, but there's a Warren H. Tipton, who was part of the platoon. And then another name that stood out for me at that time was this William Knuppel. We saw him in that little video beforehand. And all I ever knew of Knuppel was that he was a Marine buddy that we would see from time to time when Dad would winter in Arizona. And it never struck me at the time until I started doing a little bit more research on this. But if Bill ever tried to bring up the war and talk about Tarawa or Guadalcanal or Saipan, all Dad would have to say is, "Bill, those days are over." And he would tacitly comply. And it's so funny that even as 80, 90-year-old men, there was still the relationship of sergeant to lieutenant. So as opposed to my father, who never talked about the war at all, Bill was just a walking, talking encyclopedia, taking it all the way back to Iceland when Roosevelt first sent the 6th Marines there to replace the British. The people who were driven off of Dunkirk were stationed there, and they were needed back in Britain in anticipation of Germany's cross-channel invasion. So Bill has stories, he's written some things, he has typed memories, and some of these fellows remembered in dialogue, like in the Orello and Dooley passage, when they're coercing 2 Army soldiers to go AWOL from the Army on Hawaii and join the Marines for the invasion of Saipan. All of this is done in dialogue. It was just incredible listening to him and cataloging the stories. And I wasn't even thinking at first about taking notes or recording or anything like that until I went back home and thought, I wonder how many more of these men are alive. And I found 4 more fellows that were alive. And luckily, happily, they all wanted to talk to me. I think being their commander's son helped a lot. And I also think having Bill be so helpful with giving me information that only another guy in the platoon would know, like about the pig roast, you know, when they're on Hawaii and they steal the pig and they have a barbecue on the beach, and other stories like that, that they really opened up to me. And at the time, I didn't realize it, but it was really as it progressed and I made my circle trips around the United States to West Virginia, to Georgia, to Arizona, up to Montana, you know, that circle route many times, that these men were still haunted by the demons of war through nightmares, which they shared with me, and their actual nightmares are in the book. I integrated them into the storyline. And it still didn't keep them from opening old wounds and wanting to talk to me, even though talking about it would trigger these nightmares that they have and still have to this day. When I was visiting my little old guy in Georgia, Bob Smots, his wife, Jean, who, and when they first met was when they were 14 years old at an Alice Chalmers tractor show in Oklahoma. And she took me aside and said how great it was that Bob had someone to talk to. But then she also told me that as a young bride, she would wake up at night to find Bob choking her because he was still in his nightmare in combat with the Japanese engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Now imagine trying to explain why you're doing that to your 18-year-old bride, or how you even could begin. So eventually, Jean found the early trigger signs of his nightmares and was able to wake him before the nightmare began. But, you know, all of these fellows, in talking to me, would then, you know, open up the doors to reliving the battle once again. And it was also Bob Smots who said, you know, you spend your whole life trying to forget, but you relive it every day for the rest of your lives. So what I wanted to do with the collection of all of their stories and memories and information that they gave me was basically to tell their story, and how some of these, and you know, a lot of these men went home, you know, damaged goods. And it was my father who wrote in a letter home to Roxy on Saipan after the battle, how no guy is ever the same after he's been in combat. You know, the loss of an arm or a leg you can learn to live with, but the loss of your soul is something you may never recover. Pretty heady stuff to write home to a little, you know, bride cloistered away in Wisconsin who really has no clue of what combat is like. I found Don Evans' nephews, not to be a buzzkill, but Don Evans died on Saipan. And they provided me with letters and photographs and high school clippings. And it turns out he was elected Mr. Kansas City, a male beauty contest, not once, but twice. And his mom writes him letters. And once again, I'm able to integrate these into their story, where she's wondering why he's always getting these freak haircuts and how he's gonna ruin that pretty little wave in his hair. And then he sends his response, you know, saying, you know, telling her what war is really about. So initially, all of the material was compiled as an oral history. And I think it was St. Martin's Press who opined that oral histories don't sell, write it as a narrative. And I was kind of flummoxed, and I fumbled around like a drunkard in an alley with 3 or 4 lame attempts. I'm sure Jeff has seen one of them, if not more. And it was really getting nowhere. And after submitting to, your query letter to publishers, and they get excited about it, and then you submit the material and it's lacking, there are only so many people out there that would have an interest, and I was sort of running out of options. And it was in 2017 when Marvin, at the beginning of the videos, was returning the flag to Japan, and I went with him. And throughout the whole process of trying to figure out how to write it and how to begin it, people are always telling me, well, you've got to start it at a life and death moment in the middle of the book, and then leave them hanging, and then start at the beginning. And I thought, who writes like that? Gone with the Wind doesn't start with, frankly, Scarlet, I don't give a damn. For Whom the Bell Tolls doesn't start that way. But then someone gave me Unbroken, and that's how it started. And that's when I got it, on how to begin the book. And it was when they walked into an ambush, and it's the specific moment that everyone remembers in great clarity, was when one whole squad was pretty much wiped out. So I thought, well, that's where it begins. It's perfect. Smots Leeds is on point that day. He's the perfect one to introduce the story. And that's how I figured out how to start it. I also had this, same time as I had that epiphany, I also came racing back to me the teaching from a high school creative writing instructor I had, whose teaching would not have been as memorable had he not had a speech impediment. And kids always made fun of him, but he'd always preach that our writing had to be plausible, beweavable, knowable, and wife-like, with a you are there-ness quality. Now, he could have said that just normally, and I never would have remembered it. But the minute that came back into my mind, I thought, I get it now. I have to paint the picture. I have to put flesh on the bones. They're not just walking into a box canyon, they're gnarled walls. The foliage was a greater, enemy than the Japanese, and just never wanting to make stuff up. I've also found it possible to use their memories and their letters to create dialogue and to create the narrative. And the acquisition of my co-author, Cynthia Kroc, was highly instrumental in cutting the narrative down to make it readable. It's so funny. It just really is wondersome to think how anybody who wrote classics of the past could write a novel that you could sell today. Tolstoy would be told there are too many characters, and other things, other advice that we were giving. So we learned to play with the rules and figure out how to write it for today's audience. And I think we took about 2 years to construct it in this format. And we immediately had 3 agents vying for us, and we chose one. And then we had 3 publishers vying for us, and we chose one. And the amazing thing, part of the story, is it sort of never ends. The minute we send off the manuscript to the publisher, I get an email from a fellow named Richard Zuziak. And you wouldn't have noticed because the roster was up there, but there was a John Zuziak who was a member of the platoon. And he asked me if I wanted to see his father's war photos. And I said, sure. But I was thinking that they would just be stock items like, this picture of destroyed Japanese aircraft at Eslido Airfield, or this photo of the landing on Saipan. But no, it turned out that John Zuziak had a camera of his own. And you remember Chris Tipton, the fellow who posted it early on? His dad, Warren H., was just a kid when he joined the platoon. He was the only person who didn't have combat experience, and that was one of the prerequisites, but somehow he got into the platoon. And Bob Smots said they had a nickname for him. It was Herman or something like that that began with an H, but Smots always kept on calling him the Kid. So, you know, we named the book, we named Warren Tipton the book The Kid. We nicknamed him The Kid, and we had him as this scrawny kid from Detroit. And then we get these photographs, and there's Warren H for Hobart, Tipton. Every time I see this photograph, it just makes me laugh because he's such an overgrown kid. And he was just happy as hell to be there. And so we immediately had to do a rewrite and get that part of it right. The other story that Bob Smots would tell was when they went into this little off-limits village of Pololu during training on Hawaii. And I'll just pull up another little informational map to show you. Where is it? Here we go. So right in the center here, you can see Parker Ranch. Well, you can't really, but take my word for it. That's Parker Ranch. And these are the Koala Mountains. And the mission that they were supposed to go on was Smots and his platoon supposed to go in the Koala Mountains, live off the land for a while, and then report back to camp. But while they're there, they wander through it and come to these three little fingerlet canyons on the other side that they talk about. And then this little village of Pololu. Now, you know, these are old men. Their memories might be fading, or, you know, instances changed around a little bit. But he tells a story about how they wander into this village of Pololu that has been declared off limits by the FBI because the whole city was filled with Japanese sympathizers, so much so that all the men had been sent to internment camps. And the whole population was just women and children. And the head of like a spy ring there was an old woman who ran the general store, and she introduced them to some girlfriend types. And they started fraternizing and having fun. They're 19-year-old boys. The girls didn't have any boys their own age, and they were just, you know, having fun. But eventually the FBI caught wind of it, because 10 to 20 Marines in an off-limits village is, you know, going to be noticed. And eventually the head of the Hawaiian Home Guard came and got him out of there, took them to his house first, fed him lunch, and then sent them back to camp. So that's just all Bob Smots' story. But evidently, John Zuziak was on this mission as well. And he had his camera with him. And here's a little sort of photographic proof. And once again, this was just almost amazing to me that here are, you know, members of the 40 Thieves. He was a squad leader, William Knipe. This fellow here was Jesus Orozco. His smile was so brilliant, the fellows nicknamed him the Ipana Kid. Ipana was a brand of toothpaste. And this fellow was Wild Bill Emmerich. He was a club fighter out of Chicago who boasted that he had once defeated King Lewinsky. And nobody questioned his veracity, needless to say. But here's a picture of the guys with children and just girls. And so, okay, so that's one bit of wonderful thing that sort of happened afterwards that once again we have to, edit the story a little bit. Here are the girls of Pololu, and they're just such pretty girls. And these were who the guys were, having a great time with. Then the amazing thing about it, when the guys left, some of these sent 8x10 glossies autographed along with the guys. And I know that because Zuziak had one. The old woman who was the head spy took such good care of the fellows that they called her Mom. And then just to another little bit of corroboration. Where is it now? Here the fellows are at the head of the Hawaiian Home Guard's house. And that's Bob Smots, that's Wild Bill, that's the Ipana Kid, and this is the fellow Don Evans, the guy who was killed on Saipan. So, and I always get little hints and snippets from families that are just finding out about the book that really, it never really stops getting written. For instance, there's a fellow named Lonnie Jackson, who was the shortest fellow in the platoon, who was so short he got turned away the first time he went in to enlist. So he took a week to stretch himself. He tied cinder blocks to his feet and then hung from a tree for hours every day. And when they were measuring him for his height, he noticed that they would have the guys take off their shoes, but not their socks. So he put layers of cardboard inside his socks instead of inside his shoes. And the second time he went to enlist, he was exactly 5'4", which was the minimum height requirement to enlist. So it's just, it continues to be a process writing the story, because it really doesn't stop. I've been long-winded now, so I'll take a little pause in case anyone has any questions.
Thank you incredibly. That was a great presentation. Are there questions? Britt, you have to unmute people.
Yeah.
I would just like to say that I read the book. It's terrific. I recommend it. And the things that really impressed me about what Joe did was I saw like he said, I saw these reams of oral history that he had at first, and I was just really impressed how he was able to compress them down into a taut narrative that never lets up. The two things that are really, I think, important about the book and why it makes such an impact is, first of all, the characters are so beautifully drawn, and there is a certain amount of humor that goes all the way through, because these guys were fun-loving guys, and in spite of the horrible stuff they had to go through, they maintained their sense of humor, and sometimes it's laugh out loud funny. But the second thing is the horrible things that they went through, and what a different reality they were living from what their wives and sweethearts were living back home. And that was conveyed very effectively through the letters that they wrote to each other. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Mm. It must be a bit of a nightmare having written a book like this for some people coming out of the woodwork suddenly and saying, oh, I've got an enormous archive full of pictures and diaries, and you think, how can I include that now? Because it's all out. What do you think you could do? Would you do a revised version? It hasn't happened, so maybe it won't.
Well, the only thing that I can think of is if the book really takes off is to have another one, just sort of the untold stories, the things that didn't make it in the book.
Of course.
Right after it was written, I got contacted from a fellow named Don Kyle, whose father, Joe Kyle, was a Marine in the Pacific. And he had this story about how his dad and Don Evans went AWOL. They both got injured on Guadalcanal. They got sent to a field hospital in maybe New Hebrides. And they were both going to be sent home, but they both went AWOL and hitchhiked a ship back to Guadalcanal to join their troop. And he sent me a picture of his dad, Joe Kyle, and it turns out he was in my father's platoon on Tarawa. And then it became a real head scratcher as to why Joe Kyle wasn't part of this platoon, because he and Don Evans, who was a squad leader, were good buddies. And he was in my dad's platoon. And the only thing that I can think of is maybe he had malaria when the platoon was being formed, because Kyle was on Guadalcanal and that's where they got it. But it is funny. And when I first started researching the book, Knuppel always told me that he had a buddy in H Company who was an author. And he showed me the book once, and it's Leon Uris.
Yeah.
And Leon Uris's first book is called Battle Cry.
Right.
And he said that Knuppel gave it to me to read, and I just thought it was all kind of fiction, or not fiction, but everything was there. And then Knuppel started telling me that, oh, everybody this is so-and-so. He'd point out character names like High Pockets, that's Colonel Murray, or this is so-and-so. And in it, Uris writes about this notorious group of thieves in the 6th Marine Regiment. But he has them being a whole company, and which I find hard to believe. You know, you couldn't pull off these antics and be 120 men. 40 men could pull it off and no one would, bat an eye at it. But 120 men, I think someone would catch on quickly. And I said to Bill, is this platoon you guys? And he said, somewhat. And in the book, they talk about their biggest escapade was stealing an Army colonel's Jeep. So I get really geezed up about the idea about finding out from my guys. So I asked Marvin, did you guys ever steal a Jeep? And he'd go, no. Or Roscoe, no. Bob Smots, and he hesitated for a minute. And I said, well, did you guys ever steal an Army colonel's Jeep? And he said, no. And at that point, I was crestfallen. 3 strikes, you're out. But he said it was an Army captain's Jeep. And we beat the hell out of that thing. And then Al Junker Jr. Would talk, his dad would mention how they'd stolen this Jeep and would use it for their booze runs. And, you get little snippets of information that Al Junker and Philip Johnson were the only 2 fellows from Wisconsin. And I learned from Al Junker Jr. that they made a pact that if one of them didn't make it home, the other guy would go and visit the family. So Junker made it home, Philip Johnson didn't. And when the door opened up, Junker, he said he'd never been so afraid in his life because the father was the spitting image of Philip Johnson. And the mother kept on asking, how did my son die? How did my son die? And he tried to keep on skirting around the issue. But once they got outside, Al Junker said to his wife, how in the hell do you tell a mother her son had his head shot off?
I enjoyed very much your presentation, which I look forward to reading and which resonated in several ways. My uncle was killed at Guadalcanal, and so there was no issue of him not talking about it. But there is a trunk that I came across when we settled our folks' estates, which I should look at with more interest. And also Ricky Leacock, a former member and a filmmaker of the Coffee House, wrote a memoir which included his behind the lines work in the Marines. I forget which part of the military in Burma, and mentioned also his PTSD long after. And I worked for him for 3 or 4 years in the early in the late 60s, and he never spoke about his war experience. So,
As it was, I think Marvin Strombo, who is the most mild-mannered fellow you'd ever meet. He said, you know, killing is nothing to brag about.
Yeah.
And that's all they did in the Pacific.
Yeah.
And one thing that I really wanted to do is I didn't want to turn this into some rah-rah blood and guts kind of thing, because I knew what happened to these men once they came home from war.
Mm.
And I wanted to tell the whole story. And certainly it's a book about war, but a lot of the proofreaders of it, when we were sending it out to have typos corrected and things like that, said, you know, it's a book about war, but it's really an anti-war book.
Yeah.
Because all of these men's sentiments, it sort of ends with their you know, sentiments about how awful it is, you know, and how they'd never want to do it again. And it was Jesus Orozco, the Apana Kid, who said, and this line resonated not only with me, but many different people. He said, war is an awful thing, and I'd never want to do it again. But if there were another one, I'd go so my sons wouldn't have to.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the nobility of these fellows. And that's what, you know, I fell in love with, and I sort of felt compelled to tell their story because as a tribute to them. And unfortunately, only one of them is still alive today.
Yeah.
He lives in West Virginia. Marvin just passed away in June of this year. And his daughter called me on a Tuesday and said, Daddy is dying. And I hop in the car Wednesday morning. I'm out there on Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
And when I left and he died the next morning, he pointed at me and he said, Semper Fi. But at least he was able to see the book and read it beforehand. And I'd always give them, you know, whatever draft it was, give it to them to read to say, is this right? You know, is anything about this wrong? And they were, you know, always very supportive and really trying hard to remember all the time.
Joe, was there any video of, is it Knuppel?
Knuppel, yeah.
Giving the flag back in Japan?
Oh, that's Marvin Strombo that gave the flag back.
Was there any video on that?
Oh yeah, yeah. In fact, when Marvin gave the flag back to the younger brother took the flag to his face and inhaled deeply and said, "You've taken good care of my brother." Because these flags are very sacred to the Japanese. It's before any imperial soldier left for war, the family would buy a rising sun flag, and then every family member or friend would sign it with well wishes, and they would carry it with them into battle. And they believe that the spirit of the person is actually embodied in that flag. So it's a terribly sacred gift, which is why Marvin was so wanting to return it to the family someday. And if you Google Marvin Strombo and Good Luck Flag, there'll be a bunch of things on the internet that might show the return of the flag.
Can I intervene? Am I unmuted? Am I unmuted, Brett?
Yeah.
I can hear
Yes,
somebody.
you are.
Okay.
You're unmuted.
My father was one of the first doctors to enter the German places, particularly Buchenwald. And he had a real problem because a lot of the people that were coming in there wanted to give the people, the interns, Jewish interns, ice cream. And that would have ruined their entire system.
Right.
He never talked much about what he thought about the war after, but I know that it was a big problem of trying to prevent the American soldiers to go in and give ice cream or chocolate or something, which would have killed them, literally killed them, because they weren't used to anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to thank you very much, Joe, for this presentation. I think it was absolutely wonderful. I don't know whether it was Jeff who suggested this, but I can't remember.
Yes,
Um,
it was.
Mm.
Was it? Yeah. Okay.
Mhm.
I think it was absolutely wonderful. And
Joe's older brother was one of my best friends at college. That's how I know Joe.
okay,
Oh, wow.
okay.
I know that we have,
Great.
I know that Hillary has a question too. So if we have time for one more.
Okay.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Joseph, thank you so much for these incredible stories of heroism, but a very personal and different kind of heroism than what we're used to hearing. I'd love to find out about what you learned about your father writing this book.
Well, I never really wanted it to, first of all, I never really wanted to be a book about me and my dad, mainly because that's not how I learned about it. I learned about it from, from the men with whom he served.
Hmm.
And, it was always obvious that Dad was a Marine in the Pacific because he was a colonel in the Marine Corps, but that's about it. If the topic ever came up, it would immediately get, squashed. And you always loved and respected your dad, or my dad. I did. You might have to as well.
I certainly did, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But and I just want to say too that I wanted to, just as a segue, I wanted to write the first half of the book to get everybody to fall in love with these boys, either as brothers or sons or husbands or whomever. Because I wanted that attachment so that when they got killed, it would be just as impactful to you as a reader as it was to Merlin Herbert Evans or, anybody else who passed away.
Mm.
But it certainly explained a lot of idiosyncrasies that my dad had. For instance, he never would take me to 4th of July fireworks because you're landing under these artillery barrage going overhead that's incessant. I anonymized the fellow who lost it during the landing because he actually served through his term in the Marine Corps, and I didn't want his family to, I didn't want to disparage his memory to anybody. So I anonymized him. But it explained that, and how every time as a kid I would get up at night to get a drink of water, go to the bathroom, Dad would be up reading a book. Never be sleeping in bed.
Mm.
And at one point, I think later on, I asked him why, Dad, how come you don't go to bed and read in bed? He said, I just like, being up at night. And I said, why? So he said, probably an old habit. The Japanese were always active at night. So imagine 30, 40 years after the fact, in 2 years, these teenage boys lived a lifetime.
Yeah.
Very well said. I hope you're able to visit the coffee house once we can all travel again and we get to meet you in person.
Oh, I'd love to.